This was supposed to be the season that changed everything. For the first time in its history, the WNBA wasn't begging for attention. It wasn't fighting for airtime. It wasn't surviving off potential and future growth narratives. The league was finally there. Packed arenas, viral clips, record ratings, corporate money circling, new teams lining up with massive checks in hand. From the outside, it looked like women's basketball had finally crossed the line from underrated to undeniable. And that's exactly why what's happening right now is so dangerous. Because behind the highlights, behind the sold-out games, behind the headlines celebrating growth, the WNBA is quietly walking into the most unstable moment a sports league can face. The moment when success arrives before everyone agrees how to divide it. This isn't about basketball anymore. It's not about talent. It's not even about popularity. It's about control. Right now, the WNBA is caught in a three-way collision between players, owners, and time. And one wrong move could stall, fracture, or completely derail the momentum the league just fought decades to earn. Here's the part most people don't realize. Leagues don't usually collapse when nobody cares. They collapse when everybody wants more at the same time, and the system isn't built to handle it. And that's exactly what's happening here. Because while fans are arguing online about salaries, ratings, and who deserves what, something far more serious already happened behind closed doors. Something that instantly changed the power dynamic inside the league. The players voted. Not to strike yet. Not to shut things down tomorrow. But to make one thing crystal clear. If negotiations go sideways, the WNBA is officially on the brink of a stoppage. And once that door opens, history shows it never opens quietly. What makes this moment different, and far more volatile, is that this vote didn't come during a weak era. It didn't come during low ratings or empty seats. It came during the best moment the league has ever had. Which raises a terrifying question no one wants to answer out loud. How does a league that's finally winning end up closer than ever to tearing itself apart? Because the truth is, this isn't just a labor dispute. It's a stress test, and the cracks are already showing. But to understand how we got here, and why this situation is far more serious than most fans realize, you have to start with the moment everything shifted behind the scenes. The vote that changed everything. When people hear the words strike vote, they usually imagine chaos. Canceled games, empty arenas, players walking out, a league grinding to a halt overnight. That's not what this was. And that misunderstanding is exactly why so many people are underestimating how serious this moment really is. What the WNBA players did wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. And it definitely wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. The players' union voted to authorize a strike if necessary. That phrasing matters more than people realize. Because a strike authorization vote isn't about pulling the trigger. It's about loading the gun and placing it on the table during negotiations. It's a way of saying, we don't want this to happen, but we're prepared if it does. And in professional sports, that message carries weight. But here's the detail that should have made league executives nervous immediately. The vote wasn't split. It wasn't controversial. It wasn't close. It was overwhelming. That level of agreement inside a professional league almost never happens unless frustration has been building quietly for a long time. Players don't suddenly unite like that over one meeting or one proposal. They unite when they feel boxed in, when they believe the system is moving forward without them, when they see money flowing in, but feel like their seat at the table is still being treated as optional. And that's exactly what this vote signaled. Not rebellion, not ego, not greed, leverage. Because the players understand something most fans don't. The next labor deal doesn't just decide paychecks, it defines the league's future structure. This is the moment where the WNBA decides whether it remains a league where growth benefits everyone proportionally, or a league where success creates even deeper internal tension. And the players know this is their window. Why? Because leverage in sports isn't permanent. It spikes, then fades. And right now, the WNBA's leverage is at its highest point ever. Ratings are up. Attention is up. Expansion is underway. Media partners are locked in. That combination gives players power they simply didn't have 5 years ago. And they know if they don't act now, they may never get another moment like this. But here's where the situation gets complicated. The league office and owners aren't villains in some cartoon version of this story. They're looking at the exact same situation through a completely different lens, one shaped by risk, history, and long-term survival. From their perspective, the WNBA isn't cashing checks yet. It's still investing heavily. Travel upgrades, expansion costs, staffing growth, marketing, infrastructure. All of it costs money. A lot of money. So when players authorize a strike, owners don't hear fairness. They hear instability. They hear schedules collapsing. They hear broadcasters asking uncomfortable questions. They hear expansion investors getting nervous. And once investors get nervous, momentum can evaporate faster than fans realize. That's why this vote immediately raised the stakes, even without a single game being missed. Because now, every negotiation meeting carries an unspoken threat. Not a hostile one, not an aggressive one, but a real one. If this deal doesn't move forward in a way players accept, the league enters dangerous territory. And the scariest part? This isn't happening in a vacuum. The WNBA is negotiating under pressure from forces it's never had to juggle at once before. Rival leagues, global opportunities, and a player base that now has real alternatives. That changes everything. Because in past labor fights, players didn't have many places to go. The WNBA was the destination. Now, that's no longer guaranteed. Which means the strike vote wasn't just about pay or travel or benefits. It was about reminding the league of one uncomfortable truth. The players aren't trapped anymore. And once that reality sets in, negotiations stop being theoretical. They become urgent. But urgency cuts both ways. Because while players are pushing for long-term security, the league is racing against something just as powerful, the calendar. And that's where the real danger begins. Because if this situation drags on too long, the damage won't come from a strike itself. It'll come from uncertainty. Uncertainty scares networks. Uncertainty scares sponsors. Uncertainty scares new franchises that haven't even played a game yet. And uncertainty is the one thing a growing league cannot afford. Which brings us to the part almost nobody is talking about yet, the clock, and how it may be the biggest enemy the WNBA has right now. If there's one thing professional sports history teaches over and over again, it's this. Leagues don't usually get destroyed by bad intentions. They get damaged by bad timing. And right now, timing is the WNBA's most dangerous enemy. Because while fans argue about who deserves what, the league is fighting a much quieter battle behind the scenes. A battle against the calendar. And unlike negotiations, the calendar doesn't slow down, doesn't compromise, and doesn't care how justified anyone feels. Every major sports league runs on a rigid chain of events. Schedules, venues, broadcast windows, marketing rollouts, ticket sales, sponsorship commitments, travel logistics. All of it is mapped months, sometimes years, in advance. That means uncertainty is poison. And a league negotiating its labor future while simultaneously planning expansion, new media eras, and global attention is operating under the highest possible risk profile. Here's the part most fans never see. The moment a league can't confidently answer basic questions. When does the season start? How long is it? Who's playing? Under what rules? Everything downstream starts to wobble. Broadcasters hesitate. Sponsors pause campaigns. Venues hesitate to lock dates. Expansion owners start quietly asking uncomfortable questions. And the WNBA is walking straight into that zone. Because the next collective bargaining agreement doesn't just affect salaries. It determines roster rules, season structure, benefits, travel standards, and financial modeling for years into the future. That means delays don't just push conversations back, they compress everything else forward. And that compression is where mistakes happen. The league is already dealing with an unusually packed future timeline. Expansion teams are coming. New media partners are preparing for a larger spotlight. Marketing departments are planning narratives meant to turn casual interest into long-term loyalty. Those things don't wait patiently while negotiations drag on. They either get locked in, or they fall apart. And this is where the pressure quietly flips from labor dispute to existential risk. Because once you cross certain planning thresholds, even a short stoppage can cause long-term damage that never fully shows up on a balance sheet. Missed momentum doesn't come back on command. And the WNBA's momentum right now is fragile in one specific way. It's still converting attention into habit. A lot of people are watching. Not all of them are committed yet. That distinction matters more than anything. When a league is already dominant, a labor dispute hurts but rarely kills it. Fans come back because the habit is ingrained. The NFL proved that. The NBA proved that. Even MLB survived its worst moments. But when a league is still building its habit base, disruption can permanently reset the progress. That's why people inside the league are nervous, not panicked, but alert. Because the clock is ticking toward a moment where uncertainty itself becomes the story. And once that happens, the league loses control of the narrative. Right now, the story is growth. But if this drags, the story becomes instability. And instability scares casual fans far more than it scares diehard ones. Here's where the situation gets even tighter. The WNBA's future calendar isn't flexible in the way people assume. Expansion isn't just adding teams, it's adding complexity. New franchises mean new travel demands, new scheduling puzzles, new competitive balance questions, and new financial obligations. You can't finalize expansion drafts cleanly without knowing roster rules. You can't market new teams without knowing the season structure. You can't sell sponsors certainty without a locked framework. Every delay ripples outward, and that ripple doesn't wait for negotiations to conclude. This is why league offices hate prolonged labor tension more than almost anything else, even more than bad press. Because press cycles move on, planning failures don't. A delayed decision today becomes a rushed decision tomorrow. A rushed decision tomorrow becomes a regret 5 years later. And the WNBA doesn't have the luxury of learning these lessons the hard way again. Because this league has already spent decades fighting uphill battles for attention, respect, and financial stability. There's no appetite to repeat that struggle because of timing mismanagement. That's why some people inside the league see the strike authorization not as a threat, but as a warning flare. It says, this needs to move soon. But here's where the tension sharpens even more. Because the players aren't just negotiating against owners. They're negotiating against the moment itself. This surge in popularity, attention, and money, it might not last forever at the same intensity. And everyone knows it. Players feel the urgency because they understand how rare this window is. Owners feel the urgency because they know how fragile early growth can be. So you end up with both sides sprinting, but not always in the same direction. And that creates a dangerous paradox. The faster both sides move, the easier it is to misstep. Which brings us to the elephant in the room that made this negotiation combustible in the first place. Money. Not hypothetical money. Not future money. Real, tangible, incoming money. The kind of money that changes expectations overnight. Because the moment the league's financial ceiling jumps, the entire conversation shifts, and there's no going back. And that's exactly what happened next. Every sports league has a moment where the conversation shifts. Not because the game changes. Not because the talent changes, but because the money does. For the WNBA, that moment didn't arrive slowly. It didn't creep in over decades the way it did for older leagues. It hit all at once. And when it did, it rewired every negotiation in the building. For years, the league's financial story was simple: survival, investment, patience. Owners talked about long-term vision. Players talked about respect and sustainability. Fans talked about potential. Then suddenly, the conversation wasn't theoretical anymore. The league was staring at real media deals, real expansion fees, real outside interest, real valuation jumps. And once that happens, everyone starts asking the same question at the same time. Okay, so who gets what now? That's the moment things get tense. Because money doesn't just increase opportunity, it increases expectations. And expectations are where labor peace goes to die if you're not careful. Here's what made this especially volatile for the WNBA. The financial growth didn't arrive evenly. It spiked. Ratings surged. Attendance jumped. Merchandise moved. Sponsors showed up faster than the league's internal systems were designed to handle. That creates a psychological whiplash effect. Players look at the landscape and feel like the league finally caught up to their value. Owners look at the same landscape and feel like the league is still catching up to its costs. Both are true. And that's the problem. Because when both sides feel justified, compromise gets harder, not easier. For players, this moment feels overdue. They've spent years hearing about future upside, long-term plans, and building phases. Now that the upside is visible, the idea of waiting again feels unacceptable. From their perspective, this is the payoff moment. This is when years of grinding through low salaries, limited exposure, and subpar conditions were supposed to turn into real leverage. And if the league locks in a structure now that doesn't scale with growth, players fear being permanently stuck under a ceiling that doesn't reflect reality. Owners, on the other hand, see the same money and feel pressure of a different kind. Because new revenue doesn't mean free cash. It comes with expectations, higher production standards, larger marketing commitments, expanded staffing, improved facilities, increased travel costs, and a need to protect the league's reputation as it enters a bigger spotlight. In other words, growth is expensive. And here's the detail that complicates everything. Sports leagues don't just grow once. They either stabilize or they overspend and collapse under ambition. Owners are painfully aware of that history. They've seen leagues rush into massive financial commitments before their revenue base was stable enough to support them. And they've seen how fast a good story turns into a cautionary tale. So when players push for structural changes tied to revenue, owners don't just see generosity, they see long-term risk. Risk that doesn't show up in headlines. Risk that doesn't trend online. Risk that hits 5 years later when conditions change. That's why the arrival of money didn't calm negotiations. It escalated them. Because money doesn't just answer questions, it forces new ones. And one of those questions became impossible to ignore. If the league is growing this fast, why are the players still negotiating like it's struggling? That question sits at the heart of the entire conflict. Players see growth and want alignment. Owners see growth and want control. Neither side is irrational, but they are moving toward opposite conclusions. And then, right as this debate was heating up, the league made a move that symbolized everything players had been asking for, while also quietly amplifying the financial strain. They upgraded travel. And that single decision exposed the gap between symbolism and sustainability. Because improving conditions isn't just about respect, it's about budgeting. And once that budget pressure hits, every other demand gets reevaluated. Which leads directly into the next flashpoint, the one that turned progress into pressure. For years, one issue came up again and again whenever WNBA players talked about respect. Travel. Not luxury. Not perks. Not optics. Basic logistics. Commercial flights with tight turnarounds. Red-eye travel before games. Layovers that ate into recovery time. Situations where players were expected to perform at the highest level while dealing with conditions no major professional league would tolerate anymore. It wasn't just inconvenient, it sent a message. And that message stuck. So when the league finally committed to charter flights, it felt like a breakthrough. A long overdue acknowledgement that the WNBA wanted to operate like a serious professional league, not a side project. For players, it was validation. Proof that their voices had finally forced change. But for the league office and owners, it was something else entirely. A financial line in the sand. Because once you upgrade travel, you can't downgrade it. There's no walking that back without destroying credibility. That commitment becomes permanent, season after season, year after year. And permanence is expensive. Charter flights don't scale the way people assume. You're not just paying for planes, you're paying for logistics, scheduling flexibility, contingencies, and reliability. You're paying to remove uncertainty from travel entirely. That's a major expense category entering a league that's still balancing growth and sustainability. So suddenly, the negotiation room changes. What used to be a conversation about can we afford this becomes what else can we afford now that this is locked in? Because every dollar spent in one area reduces flexibility elsewhere, especially when revenue is rising but not yet stable. And this is where optics and reality collide. From the outside, fans see charter flights and think, finally, they're investing. From the inside, owners see charter flights and think, we just permanently raised the floor. Raising the floor is good, necessary even, but it also compresses margins. And compressed margins make long-term guarantees scarier. That's why this upgrade became such a pivotal moment in negotiations. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about signaling what kind of league the WNBA intends to be. Because once you operate like a major league, players expect major league economics. And once players expect that salary structures, revenue share, benefits, and roster sizes all come back onto the table with new urgency. So while charter flights were a win for players, they also hardened the league's stance on other demands. Not because owners didn't respect the players, but because they had just committed to a cost they couldn't undo. This is the part most fans miss. Sports leagues don't negotiate demands in isolation. They negotiate entire ecosystems. If you add one major upgrade, something else has to give, unless revenue can consistently outpace spending. And while the WNBA's revenue is growing, it's still in the fragile phase where growth requires careful pacing. That's why you started hearing more resistance behind the scenes after travel was finalized. Owners weren't rejecting progress. They were protecting balance. And that protection mindset is exactly what clashed with the players' momentum-driven urgency. Because from the players' perspective, travel wasn't the end goal. It was the baseline. They saw it as the first domino. Next should come higher minimums, then better benefits, then structural alignment with league success. And once you see a domino fall, you don't want the rest frozen in place. That difference in perception, baseline versus ceiling, is where negotiations got tense. Because one side felt like the league was finally catching up. The other felt like the league was sprinting toward commitments it hadn't fully stabilized yet. And while this debate played out, something else quietly entered the equation, something that reframed the entire financial conversation. Expansion. Not just new teams, but new money. And when expansion money enters a negotiation, it changes how both sides calculate leverage. Because expansion looks like proof of success, but it also creates new pressure. Which is exactly why the next section matters so much. On paper, expansion is supposed to be a celebration. New cities, new fans, new investment, new energy. For the WNBA, expansion has been framed as the clearest proof, yet that the league is finally moving forward. Teams lining up, ownership groups competing, big markets raising their hands and saying, "We want in." That doesn't happen to leagues that are dying. And that's exactly why expansion has become one of the most emotionally charged pieces of this entire situation. Because expansion means money is flowing in, and when money flows in, everyone wants to know where it's going. From the player's perspective, expansion looks like validation. It says the league is desirable. It says investors believe in the product. It says the future is bright enough that people are willing to spend massive amounts just for the right to participate. So when players hear about expansion fees climbing higher and higher, the natural reaction is simple. If the league is valuable enough for new owners to pay this much just to get a seat at the table, why are we still negotiating like the table is unstable? That question keeps coming up, quietly at first, then louder. But from the owner's side, expansion is not a cash grab. It's a commitment. Expansion fees don't just sit in a vault waiting to be handed out. They're used to fund growth, league operations, marketing, infrastructure, development, staffing, and the long-term health of the business. New teams don't magically become profitable overnight. They require support, integration, and time. So while expansion money looks like proof of success to players, it looks like fuel for reinvestment to owners. And this is where the same event starts telling two completely different stories. Players see leverage. Owners see obligation. Players see expansion as evidence that the league has made it. Owners see expansion as a reminder that the league is still building. Neither side is lying. They're just speaking different languages. But the timing makes this volatile. Because expansion is happening at the same moment players are demanding structural changes that assume long-term financial certainty. And that assumption makes owners nervous. Why? Because history is brutal to leagues that expand too aggressively without locking in stability first. Expansion increases costs before it increases returns. Travel gets more complex. Scheduling gets tighter. Competitive balance becomes harder to manage. Marketing budgets stretch thinner. So while expansion makes headlines, it also increases financial pressure behind the scenes. That pressure doesn't make owners stingy, it makes them cautious. And caution feels like resistance when players are pushing forward. This is where negotiations stop being about numbers and start being about philosophy. Players are essentially saying, growth should benefit everyone automatically. Owners are responding with, growth has to be protected before it's distributed. That philosophical divide doesn't show up in tweets, but it defines everything. And here's the part most fans don't realize. Expansion actually weakens the league's leverage in one key way. It creates more mouths to feed. More teams mean more players, more travel, more operational complexity. That makes the league more sensitive to disruption, not less. So when players authorize a strike in the middle of an expansion phase, it hits differently. It doesn't feel like pressure, it feels like risk. Because a work stoppage doesn't just affect current teams. It affects new franchises that haven't even played a game yet. Owners who just paid enormous fees suddenly find themselves staring at uncertainty before they've sold a single ticket. That's the nightmare scenario for any growing league. Which is why expansion, instead of calming negotiations, actually made them more urgent and more fragile. And then, just as both sides were trying to balance growth with stability, another factor entered the picture, one that shifted leverage away from the league entirely: alternative leagues. For the first time, the WNBA wasn't negotiating as the only game in town, and that changed everything. For most of its existence, the WNBA negotiated from a position of exclusivity. If you were one of the best women's basketball players in the world, this was the league. There were overseas options, sure, but domestically, the WNBA was the center of gravity. That gave the league leverage even when conditions weren't perfect. Because at the end of the day, there was nowhere else comparable to go. That reality no longer exists. And that single change might be the most destabilizing factor in this entire situation. Because while the WNBA was focused on expansion, media deals, and internal growth, something else was happening quietly in the background. Alternative leagues were being built with a very specific purpose. Not to replace the WNBA overnight. Not to challenge it head-to-head immediately. But to offer players leverage. And leverage changes negotiations faster than any headline ever could. These new leagues don't need to surpass the WNBA to matter. They just need to exist credibly. They just need to show players that there is another door, even if that door isn't as big yet. That's enough to shift power. From the player's perspective, alternatives change everything. Suddenly, the threat of a strike doesn't feel like jumping into the void. It feels like stepping sideways. It feels survivable. Players can earn money elsewhere. They can build brands elsewhere. They can maintain visibility elsewhere. That reality reduces fear. And fear is what leagues have historically relied on, even unintentionally, to maintain control during labor disputes. From the league's perspective, this is a nightmare scenario. Because leagues are strongest when they are irreplaceable. The moment they become optional, even temporarily, they lose negotiating power. And here's the dangerous part. Alternative leagues don't have to succeed long-term to cause damage. They only need to succeed at the margins. If a handful of top players choose different paths, the WNBA loses concentration of star power. If off-season leagues gain traction, the WNBA loses exclusivity. If players can credibly say, "We'll be fine if this pauses," the league loses urgency leverage. That doesn't mean players want to abandon the WNBA. Most don't. This is still the premier stage. The history, the legacy, the platform. But negotiations aren't about love. They're about options. And right now, players have more options than they've ever had before. This is why the strike authorization landed differently this time. In the past, a strike threat might have felt risky for players. Now it feels calculated, and owners know that. Which is why the league has been trying to project calm and confidence publicly, even as pressure builds privately. Because once the perception sets in that players can walk away without catastrophic consequences, the entire balance of power shifts. And here's the subtle danger: fragmentation. The WNBA's biggest strength has always been being the league. The place where the best compete together, where storylines converge, where rivalries mean something. Alternative leagues threaten that not by overtaking it, but by slicing pieces off. If players split time, if attention splits, if fans have to choose between multiple products featuring overlapping stars, the WNBA doesn't disappear, but it weakens. And that's the scenario everyone wants to avoid, even the players. Which makes this moment incredibly delicate. Because if negotiations fail, alternative leagues gain momentum. If negotiations succeed but leave players dissatisfied, alternative leagues gain momentum anyway. So the league isn't just negotiating a contract. It's negotiating relevance. And that's why owners are so resistant to locking in structures that could backfire if growth slows. They're not just protecting finances, they're protecting centralization. But players see that protection as gatekeeping. They see a league benefiting from their labor while hesitating to share control proportionally. And when you combine that perception with rising attention, rising money, and rising alternatives, patience evaporates. This is where the narrative online starts to fracture. Fans begin arguing in extremes. Pay them everything. Shut it down. They're ungrateful. The league is doomed. But behind the noise, the real issue is far more complicated. The WNBA is trying to evolve from a survival-based model into a growth-based one, without losing cohesion. Players are trying to ensure that evolution doesn't leave them locked into outdated terms. And both sides are doing this while outside forces are actively testing the league's grip on its own ecosystem. That's not a stable environment for compromise. It's a pressure cooker. And when pressure cookers don't release steam carefully, they explode. Which brings us to the argument that dominates every comment section and talk show, but is rarely understood correctly. The money numbers. Who's losing money? Who's making money? And why those numbers are being used like weapons. That's where the next section takes us. If you want to understand why this situation feels so toxic online, you have to understand one thing first. Numbers are not neutral. In sports, numbers aren't just facts, they're weapons. They're framed, selected, and repeated until they support whatever side is speaking the loudest. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the way people talk about WNBA finances. You've heard the claims. The league loses money every year. They're not profitable. Why should players get more when the business isn't even working? On the surface, those statements sound definitive, logical, end of discussion. But beneath them is a mess of half-truths, incomplete context, and fundamentally different definitions of success. Because when people say loses money, what they usually mean is this. After accounting for operating expenses, investments, upgrades, marketing, and infrastructure, the league isn't posting massive net profits. What they don't say is why. Sports leagues, especially growing ones, often choose to reinvest revenue instead of maximizing short-term profit. That reinvestment can show up as losses on paper while still building long-term value. Facilities upgrades, travel improvements, staff expansion, marketing pushes, technology investments. All of that costs money now so the product can scale later. From the owner's perspective, this is smart business. It's patience. It's planting seeds instead of harvesting too early. From the player's perspective, it feels like a moving target. Because every time the league improves, the response is, yes, but we're still not profitable yet. That phrase becomes a wall. Players hear it year after year while seeing tangible signs of growth all around them. Bigger crowds, louder coverage, more visibility, more demand. So they start asking a different question. If the league keeps growing, why does our share always feel fixed? That's the emotional core of the dispute. And this is where numbers stop being math and start being psychology. Owners look at the books and see risk. Players look at the same environment and see momentum. Owners say, we've invested for decades. We're still stabilizing. Players say, we're finally driving value. Don't freeze us out now. Both sides feel like the other is ignoring reality. And that's because they're measuring different realities. Owners measure sustainability. Players measure fairness. Those two things don't automatically align. This is why the conversation around losses becomes so heated. Fans hear losing money and assume failure. Players hear it and assume deflection. Owners hear skepticism and feel misunderstood. And once that emotional loop forms, it feeds itself. Online discourse doesn't help, because simplified narratives spread faster than nuanced ones. It's easier to say, the league loses money, end of story, than to explain how investment cycles work in growing sports leagues. It's easier to say, pay them what they're worth, than to explain why cash flow timing matters. So both sides dig in. Players start emphasizing how underpaid they feel relative to the attention they generate. Owners start emphasizing how fragile the business still is. And every time someone brings up numbers, it hardens positions instead of softening them. Here's the part that makes this especially volatile. The WNBA is no longer in the phase where it can hide behind obscurity. When nobody's watching, financial explanations don't matter. When everybody's watching, they matter a lot. Public scrutiny changes expectations. Players don't just compare themselves to the past anymore. They compare themselves to what they see in other leagues. They see revenue sharing. They see scaling contracts. They see alignment between growth and compensation. And even if the WNBA isn't ready for full parity, the psychological shift has already happened. Once players see a different model, it's almost impossible to convince them to accept a permanently capped one. That's why the argument keeps coming back to structure. Not just how much players make now, but how that number changes when the league succeeds. Owners resist automatic scaling because automatic obligations can become traps if growth slows. Players resist fixed ceilings because fixed ceilings feel like a denial of their role in success. And so the negotiation gridlocks, because neither side wants to commit to a future that could leave them exposed. And here's the uncomfortable truth no one likes admitting. Both sides are protecting themselves. Owners are protecting the league from overextension. Players are protecting themselves from being undervalued during the most important years of their careers. That's not greed. That's rational behavior under uncertainty. But rational behavior on both sides can still produce irrational outcomes, especially when timing, momentum, and outside pressure collide. Which brings us to the demand that sits at the center of everything, the one phrase that instantly raises blood pressure in every negotiation room: revenue share. Because once that phrase enters the conversation, you're no longer negotiating salaries. You're negotiating power. There's a moment in every major labor negotiation where the conversation stops being about tweaks and starts being about identity. For the WNBA, that moment arrived the instant the phrase revenue share became non-negotiable. Because revenue share isn't just a financial mechanism. It's a declaration. It says, we are partners, not participants. And that idea terrifies one side, while feeling absolutely necessary to the other. From the player's perspective, revenue share represents alignment. It's the cleanest way to ensure that if the league succeeds, the people on the floor succeed with it. No more lag. No more renegotiating value every few years. No more hoping leadership decides to be generous. Growth would automatically mean progress. That's powerful. And once players understand that model, once they see how it works elsewhere, it becomes very hard to accept anything that feels structurally inferior. Because here's the truth players are wrestling with: careers are short. Windows are narrow. If the league explodes in popularity for 5 or 6 years and the system doesn't scale, those players never get another shot at fair alignment. They don't get a do-over. So when players push for revenue share, they're not just asking for money. They're asking for insurance against being left behind during the most important growth phase the league has ever seen. Owners, however, hear something very different. They hear permanent obligation. They hear loss of flexibility. They hear a model designed for leagues with decades of stable dominance being applied to a league that is still defining its floor. Revenue share works best when revenue is predictable, when downturns are survivable, when media rights, sponsorships, and attendance are locked into long-term certainty. The WNBA isn't fully there yet, and that's why owners push back so hard. Because once revenue share is locked in, it's incredibly difficult to unwind. If revenue dips, obligations don't magically disappear. If costs spike unexpectedly, the league still owes the same percentage. From an ownership standpoint, that's not partnership, it's exposure. And here's the part that makes this emotional. Owners don't see themselves as villains withholding value. Many of them see themselves as caretakers who carried the league through years when profits weren't even a conversation. They remember the lean years. They remember subsidizing operations. They remember skepticism from sponsors. They remember empty seats and limited coverage. So when players arrive at this moment and say, now we want a system that guarantees our share forever, it can feel, from the ownership side, like rewriting history. Like ignoring who absorbed the risk when success wasn't guaranteed. That's why these conversations get tense fast. Because both sides feel morally justified. Players feel they are finally being heard. Owners feel they are being rushed into commitments that ignore past sacrifice. And once negotiations reach that emotional level, progress slows dramatically. That's when talks stop being about spreadsheets and start being about trust. Do players trust ownership to share future success fairly without being forced? Do owners trust players not to demand more every time revenue spikes? Right now, the answer on both sides feels shaky, which is why compromise becomes so difficult. There are middle ground ideas, escalators, triggers, tiered sharing based on benchmarks. But even those require one thing that's currently in short supply: confidence in the future. Players worry that without structural guarantees, they'll always be told to wait one more cycle. Owners worry that with structural guarantees, they'll lose the ability to manage volatility responsibly. That tension doesn't resolve itself easily. And it's made worse by one unavoidable reality. The league's identity is changing faster than its systems. The WNBA is no longer just fighting for survival. It's fighting to define what kind of league it wants to be. A league that mirrors older models, or a league that forges its own structure based on its unique path. That decision matters. Because once it's made, it shapes everything: salaries, negotiations, expansion, and how future stars view the league. And hovering over all of this is a truth nobody wants to say too loudly. If this deal goes wrong, the damage won't show up immediately. It'll show up slowly. In players choosing different paths. In fans feeling disconnected. In growth flattening instead of accelerating. Which brings us to the human element that amplifies all of this pressure. The moment, the spotlight, and the weight of carrying an entire league's future on a single surge of attention. Because success doesn't just create opportunity. It creates expectations. And expectations are unforgiving. Every league gets moments of growth. But not every league gets this kind of moment. What the WNBA is experiencing right now isn't just gradual progress. It's a surge. A collision between years of groundwork and a sudden explosion of mainstream attention. The kind of attention that rewrites how the public views a league almost overnight. And that's where the pressure becomes unbearable. Because when growth is slow, mistakes are forgivable. When growth is explosive, mistakes get remembered forever. The WNBA is no longer operating in the shadows. Every decision is being watched, dissected, and debated in real time. Players know it. Owners know it. Media knows it. Fans know it. That changes behavior. Players feel the weight of representation. They're not just negotiating for themselves, they're negotiating for the next generation. For players who won't have to explain why their league deserves respect. For players who won't have to wait decades for alignment. That's a heavy burden. Owners feel a different kind of weight. They're responsible for protecting something that finally has momentum. Something fragile. Something that could either become a permanent part of the sports landscape or fade back into niche territory if mishandled. And here's the brutal truth. Both sides are terrified of wasting this moment. Players fear locking themselves into a deal that undersells their value during the league's breakout era. Owners fear a disruption that interrupts habit formation before it fully takes hold. Because attention is fickle. People say they'll come back. Sometimes they don't. That's why this negotiation feels so emotional, even when everyone tries to stay professional. Because there's no redo. If this moment is mishandled, there isn't another guaranteed surge waiting around the corner. There isn't a promise that the next wave of attention will be bigger, stronger, or longer. This might be the wave. And waves don't pause while people argue about who should surf first. That's what makes the current tension so dangerous. The league is trying to convert interest into loyalty. Players are trying to convert leverage into security. Owners are trying to convert growth into stability. Those goals aren't incompatible, but they're competing for priority. And the moment demands decisions faster than comfort allows. This is where history starts whispering warnings. Sports history is full of leagues that reached a tipping point and stumbled. Not because the product wasn't good. Not because fans didn't care. But because internal conflict disrupted momentum at exactly the wrong time. The WNBA isn't immune to that risk. And here's the hardest part to accept. Even if everyone acts in good faith, damage is still possible. A prolonged standoff doesn't need to cancel an entire season to hurt the league. It just needs to inject doubt. Doubt in fans who are still deciding how invested they want to be. Doubt in sponsors who want certainty. Doubt in young players choosing where to build their careers. That's why this moment is so delicate. Because success raised the stakes faster than the league's systems were designed to handle. And that brings us to the final truth. The one that explains why the WNBA is shutting down keeps trending, even when it's not literally true. The WNBA isn't collapsing. It isn't disappearing. It isn't over. But it is at war with its own success. For decades, the fight was external. Visibility, respect, investment, survival. Now the fight is internal. Who controls growth? Who benefits from success? Who carries risk? And who decides what fair looks like in a league that's finally breaking through? The strike authorization didn't mean players want to burn the league down. It meant they refused to be locked out of its future. The owner's resistance doesn't mean they don't respect the players. It means they're afraid of overcommitting before the foundation fully settles. Both sides are trying to protect something. The problem is, they're protecting it in different ways. And the league doesn't have infinite time to figure it out. Because momentum is not permanent. Attention is not guaranteed. And patience is thinning on all sides. So when people say the WNBA is shutting down, what they're really reacting to is uncertainty. A sense that something historic is being decided right now, and that the wrong outcome could change the league's trajectory for years. The next deal won't just set salaries. It will set trust. It will set precedent. It will define whether growth feels shared or contested. And here's the final question that hangs over everything. If a league finally reaches its moment, but can't agree on how to handle it, does that moment lift everyone up or tear them apart? That answer hasn't been written yet. And that's why this story isn't over. If you want the next breakdown, what a realistic compromise could actually look like, who secretly holds more leverage than people think, and what history says happens next, make sure you subscribe right now so you don't miss it. And drop a comment below. Is a strike a necessary power move in this moment, or a risk the WNBA can't afford? Because the future of the league might depend on how that question gets answered.